The national political climate in recent years has intensified divisions about the way people in the United States engage with their past. In urban school systems, including the one in Boston, there have been efforts to shift a historical and cultural perspective closer to the lives of students and their families. The Boston Teachers Union wants to take that development to a higher level with a new proposal for ethnic studies. To explain is one of the teachers leading the effort, Cecil Carey. Thank you very much for being with us, Cecil.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about the work we've been doing.
So I know in your recent capacity, you've been an Americorps history teacher at Charlestown High School, but take us a little back to maybe when you were a student and what it was like growing up and what this particular topic means to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I identify as being a white passing person of color. My grandfather is Black. My father and I, and my brother, all identify as being biracial. And truly, my experience growing up was the dominant narrative. I learned about the American Revolution. I learned about the greatness of this country. I didn't really hear the contributions of people like my family and people of color historically. It wasn't until I got to college at Vassar where I was really able to have those conversations, both about the contributions of people of color to American history, also about oppression and how it structures our world, systemic oppressions like race, gender, sexuality, and class. And so what we're trying to do is really bring those conversations to the high school level, because we know that our Black and brown students are capable of having these deep conversations. We know they need to have these conversations and have this analysis to be able to make sense of the world they live in, the Boston that exists for them.
Cecil, I was blessed with a great American history teacher in the Boston Public Schools, but I also had a civics teacher who put me to sleep. What about your experiences teaching the students at Charlestown High School and getting them engaged? What was that like?
Yeah, absolutely. So at Charlestown High, we have a really interesting mix of students. We have a lot of immigrant students, particularly Colombian students, because we get a large number of students from East Boston. But we have students from across the city as well. I have Irish students, Cape Verdean, Dominican. And so when you have all these cultural identities in the room, you really students want to see themselves reflected in the material. They want to be able to connect personally to the history that they're studying, both their people and also themselves today. And so when I'm designing a unit in my history class, I'm always trying to make connections to how does this affect your community, your family, here and now.
Well, I know these students, they might come from families where there is a lot of pride in their history and their culture. But once you get outside the home, I imagine these students are bombarded with messages that culture doesn't matter. It's not as good as the mainstream or something else. How does that affect the ability of these students to achieve?
Chris, you're absolutely right. If you're constantly bombarded with negative messages about your people, you're going to internalize some of those messages. And so in ethnic studies, something that we say is that you're not just learning, you're also unlearning this dominant narrative, the master narrative that's told about our country and about your group of people. Because it is hard to motivate, exactly as you said. It's hard for students to feel like school is for them when they're constantly told that their people are lazy or they don't belong. And so disrupting those narratives is really important for students' sense of self-worth, but it absolutely connects to academic achievement as well.
Well, one thing that dies hard is the argument that teaching about history or culture should be assimilationist. That's what the public schools are supposed to do. And now more recently, we have this idea it should be anti-racist. Why make that shift?
So we think that shift is so important because we see the oppression going on in the world today and how it affects our students' lives. We're in the middle of a pandemic that disproportionately affects Black and brown communities, and of course the racist violence going on around the country and here in the city of Boston as well. And so students are affected by that. They see it in the news, and we need to give them the lenses, the tools, the concepts that they need to be able to talk about it and make sense of it. Because that's really what will make this country great, is having these difficult conversations, not sweeping them under the rug. And so that's why we've created our ethnic studies proposal, because we know that it's difficult to have these sort of conversations in your classrooms. And so we want to train teachers through a coaching model, through a cohort model, to be able to have those tough conversations, support their students, and build community.
Well, I know you're talking right now about taking this to a higher level in a pilot program at a limited number of schools. How exactly would you do this with you? Because I'm sure not every teacher wants to engage in this subject matter, at least, and some who do, maybe they need more background. So how would you accomplish that?
Absolutely. So for the past 2 years, the BTU's Ethnic Studies Now committee has been doing this sort of work. We've been recruiting teachers, we've been educating ourselves, and we've been connecting to the national network of ethnic studies teachers. So we've learned lessons from places like LA, Arizona, Providence, where there have been great successes and also important failures to learn from in ethnic studies. And what you're saying about training teachers is really the key behind our proposal and why we're pushing this campaign to get Boston Public Schools to implement it. Because,
Yeah, go ahead.
oh, well, we wanted to say that, it's one thing to have ethnic studies as a choice that a student can take. It's a one thing to have a syllabus, but it's a much different thing to be able to teach that each and every day in your classroom. And so we're advocating for a coaching model. So teachers are trained with summer PD and throughout the year check-ins with a coach to make sure that they're staying on track and make sure that the conversations they're having with students truly are anti-racist and are really building community and helping students connect to the cultural wealth of their identities.
I can also imagine students talking to people in their families or even on their street about things they normally would not bring up. What would that be like?
Absolutely. So a tenet of ours is holding space for personal narrative. We believe that the personal is part of the political and it's as important as the historical narratives that we read. And so part of that means just talking about experiences that students have had with racism, with privilege, in school, and taking those conversations seriously because students have experiences of oppression, but they don't necessarily have the language to talk about them. And so we really just want to help students understand how to talk about systemic oppression so that they can make sense of the world that they experience in their communities.
We should finally mention there are more details about this. Is there still a place people can find that, maybe on a BTU website?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a website ourselves, so you can just go to bit.ly/BTU Ethnic Studies to find our proposal. And we are really just trying to recruit people and educate people on what ethnic studies is. Because ethnic studies is not the same as a multicultural history class. It really is about creating those spaces for students to connect to their communities, to engage in activism. So it's content, it's learning the histories of people of color, but that's not all. It's also pedagogy. It's really just turning around the classroom so that there's not an expert at the front of the room. We're all learners in an ethnic studies classroom. We're all figuring out our own identities, our places in the world, and we're engaging in struggle together to make the world a better place.
Sounds like pedagogy of the oppressed. Thank you very much for being with us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Cecil Carey from the Boston Teachers Union.